All right, welcome back everybody to our final session of day one titled Student Mobility in BC. One of the strengths of the BC transfer system and something that really differentiates British Columbia from other jurisdictions is the volume of research conducted on student mobility in general. I have had the opportunity, at least back in the old days when we used to travel, where I would often go to other provinces to talk about what we do in British Columbia. And one of the things that they would ask is well, why does BC have such a comprehensive transfer system? Well, the student mobility research is really the backbone upon which all the articulation activity resides. You know, it provides proof of the work that we are doing to support the thousands upon thousands of students that move from one institution to another on an annual basis. Many of you will be familiar with Joanne Heslop, who is our Student Transitions Project Manager. The Student Transitions Project is a collaborative system-wide research partnership involving BC's education and advanced education ministries, along with public post-secondary institutions and BC CAT. Joanne conducts research studies for the STP to help advance the understanding of student transitions from high school to post-secondary education, from student success to student mobility, as well as enrollment trends in the BC system. Now, if you have seen Joanne give presentations in the past, at least in person, you will know that she has a habit of throwing candy at her attendees. That's not because they're asking bad questions. It's actually because when they ask good questions, she likes to throw candy at them. She won't be able to do that this time, at least not physically, but I would encourage you that if you have any candy nearby, feel free to partake while Joanne provides an overview of the state of student mobility in BC. Here you go.
Okay, thanks, Mike. My presentation is on student mobility in BC. So what is the Student Transitions Project for those of you who are not familiar with the STP? It's a collaborative research project that measures student access or student success from the K-12 system to post-secondary education, and it collects, evaluates, and reports on student transition rates from high school to post-secondary, student mobility among public post-secondary institutions, post-secondary retention and completion, and the research is conducted by securely linking encrypted student identifiers across BC's education systems. And it's managed by a steering committee with representation from the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Advanced Education and Skills Training, the research-intensive universities, the colleges, institutes, and teaching-intensive universities, and BC CAT. So in terms of an agenda for today, I'll be talking about mobile students, mobility between sectors and regions, traditional transfer students, other student mobility measures, and finally, mobility trends with some analysis. So before I jump right in, let's get a little COVID-19 context here. Some of you might be wondering whether the STP can evaluate the impact of COVID-19 on student mobility. Unfortunately, we can't do that yet, and that's because of the timelines here. This chart represents the number of new cases of COVID-19 in BC, and so you can see the timeline of our reporting period ends just as the pandemic is getting started. We do have some early fall data, but it's not for the full year. So we'll have to wait until our next analysis in another year or two. So, mobile students. How does the STP define student mobility? It's the sequential or simultaneous enrollment in multiple post-secondary institutions, and it's limited to BC public post-secondary institutions. Primarily, it focuses on academic credit registrants. And so what is a mobile student? It's a student who switches institutions relative to their previous registration. And students take different types of mobile pathways. They could move to a new institution that they haven't attended in the past, so they moved there for the very first time. That's called a move. Or you could return to an institution previously attended. That's called a return. Or you can do a move or return after a stopout period of non-registration. So what is the student mobility rate? It's the proportion of academic credit registrants who switched institutions. So if we begin with all academic credit registrants in 2019-20, about 345,000 students, we know that 68% of those students continued at the same institution where they were in the previous year. and that there are about 23% of the students who are enrolled are new to the STP. Either they came through the BC K-12 system and they're new entrants from grade 12 graduation, or they're new to the STP from some other source. So that leaves us with 55,737 students, and those are the mobile students, and that's a 16% mobility rate. Now, remembering those definitions that I provided earlier, what are the different mobile pathways of these mobile students? 6% are movers, 5% returns, 5% are stop-out moves, and 1% are stop-out returns. So who are those mobile students? We can look at the demographics of these students, remembering that the student mobility rate is about 16%. We can see that females are more mobile than males. Aboriginal students have a higher mobility rate than non-Aboriginal students, 22% versus 15.6%. Domestic students are more mobile than international students. And by program area, we can see that some programs have students that are much more mobile than others, comparing personal improvement and leisure at 43.8% to visual and performing arts at 9.5%. And finally, students who have earned a credential are more likely to switch institutions in the subsequent period compared to those who did not yet receive a credential. So let's look now at mobility between sectors and regions. What proportion of student mobility occurs within the same institution type? Well, 79% of student mobility occurs between different institution types. So that means that only 21% of student mobility occurs within the same sector. So for example, research university to research university or college to college. And what proportion of student mobility occurs within the same region? Well, since 39% occurs between regions, that leaves 61% of the student mobility occurs within the same region. So what are the patterns of student mobility between institution types and regions in BC? We can show this quite simply with a visual diagram here, where we have each of the institution types, and we can see relatively balanced student mobility between them: colleges, institutes, research universities, and teaching intensive universities. We have a more complex diagram, which I'll show briefly on the next slide. We can also look at mobility between regions, and we can see that a lot more student mobility occurs in this yellow zone called Mainland Southwest compared to the other regions. That's because most of the institutions in the province of BC are located in the Mainland Southwest. The other regions listed here are Thompson, Okanagan, Kootenays in green, Vancouver Island in purple, and Cariboo North in blue. And there is a more complex diagram that gives more details, which I will also show briefly. So how many students moved between institution types in 2019-20? Here are the 4 different institution types with their total enrollments in 2019-20 shown in the boxes. And then we can show you how many students move between those institution types. And these little loopback arrows are representing those 21% of students who switched institutions but stayed in the same sector. And of course, we have new students entering the system every year. And don't forget that the vast majority of students don't switch institutions at all, but they continue on at the same institution where they were last enrolled. And so how many students move between regions in 2019-20? Here we have the 4 regions of the province: Cariboo North, Mainland Southwest, Vancouver Island, and Thompson, Okanagan, Kootenays, with the largest number of students in the Mainland Southwest region. And we have the student mobility between those regions, but of course, as you recall, 61% of student mobility occurs within the same region, and the largest amount of student mobility occurs in the Mainland Southwest region, with 26,400 students moving between institutions in that region. And we have the new students every year, and of course, most students are continuing on at the same institution where they last enrolled. Let's move on to traditional transfer students. What is a traditional transfer student? Well, that's defined as a student who transfers from a BC post-secondary institution to a research-intensive university with a basis of admission, a BC college or BC associate degree, a minimum of 24 credits, and a minimum cumulative GPA of 2.0. So why do we define them this way? Well, historically, these were the minimum requirements for transfer students to enter a research university within BC. And currently, these are also the requirements for associate degree students to transfer into a degree program at research-intensive universities in BC. So how many traditional transfer students moved to research-intensive universities in 2019-20? There were 5,050, and here you can see the trends over time. And you can see that consistently for the last decade or so, we've had just under about 5,000 students that are classified as traditional transfer students, and they enroll in the research universities in BC. And so which institutions were those? So at SFU, there are 2,443 students who enrolled as a traditional transfer student in 2019-20. And you can see above that number a little trend line. And so the minimum and maximum points are also provided at the bottom of the screen there. So you can see how that trend compares to the image on the left. Traditional transfer students entering UBC Vancouver, about 1,055. Similar number for UVic. UBCO, about a third as many, 341 students, and 179 entering UNBC. So where do those students come from? Well, they come from the other institution types in BC, with 53% coming from BC colleges, 18% from teaching intensive universities, just a sliver of 1% each from research universities and institutes, and the balance come from the BC private institutions at about 31%. And then in total, we have our total number of traditional transfer students. Those percentages add up to more than 100% because students can come from multiple sources. The students coming from other private institutions, that's an estimate based on the fact that these are new students coming in as BC transfer students, but they have no previous record of any enrollment in the BC, in the STP. So we assume that they must be coming from BC private institutions. So what are the trends? In terms of college transfer students, it's been relatively flat, around about 2,500 students per year coming in as traditional transfer students into research universities. About 10 years ago, there were about 56% of the students coming in from BC colleges, but now it's 53%. Teaching intensive universities, there's a decline in the number of students coming in from TIUs, so an 8% share drop. Not very many students coming in from institutes and research-intensive universities, and an increasing trend in the number of students coming in from BC privates, increasing from about 20% 10 years ago, and now that represents 31% of traditional transfer students coming into research universities. So there are other measures of student mobility, and we'll look at some of those. So we can measure it in terms of simultaneous enrollment, or number of institutions attended over time to earn a credential, or student retention rates, and we can use those as a proxy for student mobility. So let's look at the first one here. What proportion of fall 2019 registrants attended more than one institution simultaneously? Well, 2% attended more than one institution simultaneously. That's 6,535 students. So 98% of students attended just one institution. So let's look at the breakdown of those students who attended more than one institution. 6,432 students attended 2 institutions at the same time. 101 students attended 3, and 2 students attended 4 institutions simultaneously in the fall of 2019. So in which institutions did these students enroll simultaneously? Well, we know that we have 25 post-secondary institutions, and if you pair up all the different possible pairs, you'd have about 625 pairs of institutions, but I've listed the top 20 pairs of institutions where students were enrolled at the same time. And this represents about 56% of all those students who are enrolled in more than one institution. And so you can see there's a common thread here that most students are enrolled at TRU and some other institutions. So 568 at TRU and UVic, for example. A different way of looking at this is to identify the number of students who are enrolled in your institution, but also enrolled somewhere else. So at TRU, for example, 12.9% of their registrants are also enrolled in another institution. At JIBC, 8% of those students enrolled in the fall of 2019 were also enrolled at another institution at the same time, and so forth. So how many institutions did the 2019-2020 bachelor's degree completers attend throughout their education from start to finish? Well, here you can see the distribution. 57% of those bachelor's degree completers only attended one institution throughout their education, 29% attended two, 10% attended three institutions, and 4% attended 4 or more institutions throughout their education. So for an average of 1.6 post-secondary institutions attended. And finally, how can student mobility help us better understand student retention? So here what we can do is we can take 24,871 students who entered bachelor's degrees in the fall of 2015-16 and follow them over time and see how many remain in their institution where they first enrolled. So by the spring, there were 23,465. And in the summer, that number drops off, comes back up to 20,131 in the fall of 2016-17, and so forth. And so from here, we can calculate the student retention rates over time for students who were retained in the institution where they first enrolled, 80%, 69%, 59%, and so forth in each of the subsequent years. But the other way of looking at this is the fact that students who are not retained in your institution might have in fact moved to a different institution. So the benefit of the STP is that it allows us to identify that these students are actually still enrolled somewhere in the BC system. And so you can see the numbers on the left here are slightly larger than the numbers on the right for each of the subsequent years after the entry year. And so we can calculate those retention rates, and then we can calculate a form of student mobility that's derived by taking the difference between the system retention rate and the institution retention rate. So you can see that the mobility rate can be derived here at 6% at the beginning of the second year, 8% at the beginning of the third year, 11% mobility at the beginning of the fourth year, and so forth. And so students do become increasingly more mobile over time. Now let's look at mobility trends. What are the student mobility trends? So we'll start by looking at the number of mobile students, and we can see that the number of mobile students has been increasing over time, except in the most recent time period, where it has taken a bit of a drop, even with an adjustment for delayed data that might show up the next time we do this analysis. The student mobility rate has been declining from its highest point of 19% in 2008-09 to its current level of 16.1%. And at the same time, the number of institutions awarding bachelor's degrees has been increasing and is now leveled off at 23 institutions that award bachelor's degrees in BC. So looking at that top line in the previous slide, why did the number of mobile students decline in 2019-20? Well, the number of academic registrants has declined, and we identify the students who are mobile from this set of academic credit registrants. So obviously, that's going to affect the number of mobile students. But what about the student mobility rate? Why is that rate declining? So as I mentioned previously, that the student mobility rate has declined from its high of 19% to its current level of 16.1%. So what are some of the possible reasons for this declining mobility rate? I think there's 3 possible reasons. There might be others. The growth in bachelor's degree completion opportunities in institutions that did not traditionally offer bachelor's degrees might be one of the reasons. Bachelor's degree completers are attending fewer institutions to complete their degree. And the growth in international students. These students are not as mobile within BC as domestic students. So these three factors contribute to fewer mobile students, despite the overall enrollment growth, and this is lowering the mobility rate. So let's look at this a bit more closely. Growth in bachelor's degree opportunities in BC. So if we take the students who are seeking a bachelor's degree and they're enrolled in a college, they might choose to move to another institution, or they could continue at the college. So what are the trends? If we follow that green line, we can see that students are increasingly likely to continue at the college. We can do the same for students enrolled in bachelor's degrees at teaching-intensive universities. They could move to another institution, or they could continue at the teaching-intensive university. So let's follow the orange line, and you can see that students are increasingly likely to continue at the teaching-intensive university rather than switching institutions. So as degree completion opportunities expand in colleges and TIUs, a growing number of bachelor's degree seekers are continuing at colleges and TIUs because they do not need to move to a research university to complete their degree. Here's the second factor. Bachelor's degree completers are attending fewer institutions to complete their degree. So if we look at a cohort of bachelor's degree completers from 2012-13 and look backwards over time to identify how many institutions they attended, we can see the distribution here. And so 54% of them attended more than one institution to complete their degree. If we look at a more recent cohort of bachelor's degree completers in 2019-20, we see that only 43% attended more than one institution to complete their degree. So on average, the 2012-13 bachelor's completers attended more institutions. And finally, the growth of international students is affecting the student mobility rate. The growth in domestic students has actually been relatively flat, while international student growth has almost tripled over the last decade. But what about the student mobility rate of these two different groups? Domestic students have mobility rates that are about double the mobility rate of international students. And this is in fact pulling down the average for the overall student mobility rate. You can see that the mobility rate has declined from 18.2% to 16.1% for all students, because the number of international students has been growing and they are less mobile. So let's conclude by wrapping up some of the indicators of student mobility from 2019-20. We have 55,737 mobile students with a 16% mobility rate. Students move between institutions, institution types, and regions in all directions, primarily between institution types within the same region after credential completion. And 9% of all mobile students are traditional transfer students, with 5,050 entering research universities in 2019-20, primarily from colleges and teaching-intensive universities. And in terms of the long-run mobility trends, we've seen a steady growth in the number of mobile students, except in 2019-20. We've seen relatively little change in the number of traditional transfer students, and a growing share of traditional transfers to research universities from BC privates, while the colleges and teaching-intensive universities are sending proportionately fewer transfers to research universities. And finally, we looked at the decline in the student mobility rate. Three possible reasons for that: bachelor's degree expansion, students attending fewer institutions to complete a degree, and the growing share of international students who are less mobile in BC than the domestic students. So if you're looking for more detailed information, there is a report. It's just in the final review stages at this point. It will eventually be posted on the STP website, and the link for that site is provided at the bottom of the screen. And as usual, I'd love to throw some candies, which is typically what I would do in a live presentation, but I'm not able to do that. So I'll just leave you with the thought of candies, and then we can take any questions or comments or suggestions. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for that presentation, Joanne. It's my pleasure to introduce everybody to Joanne Heslop, the STP manager. Thank you for being here today. We have a few questions already in the chat. Thank you to everybody who's been posting questions in the Q&A. The first question is from Karen Langen from College of the Rockies. She's asking about the 2019-2020 data. Is this covering the months September 2019 to September 2020, or is it a different definition for the academic year?
Yeah, it's the full academic year. So that's September 2019 right through to August 31 of 2020.
Okay. And we have Todd Stuckless from Langara College who asks, is there any data for the number of students that are at one public and one private school at the same time?
In this particular analysis, no. The student mobility analysis just looks exclusively at students enrolled in the BC public post-secondary system. However, we have done some research, which you can find on the STP public website if you search that up. And there's some information on students who are enrolled in BC public and BC private institutions. And I'm just wondering now, I mean, we have transitions into BC privates, but as far as dual enrollment in both public and private, in fact, we haven't done research on that.
All right, and so somewhat similar to that, we have Lorianne Austin, who is asking, are students who take courses simultaneously on campus and online considered to be attending two institutions?
Yes, I mean, if they're attending an institution on campus at institution A and attending courses online at institution P and institution B, then yes, those students would be considered to be enrolled in two institutions simultaneously. If it's the same institution online and face-to-face, then that would not be considered two institutions simultaneously.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then are there studies underway in regards to barriers to student mobility?
Studies on barriers to student mobility. The STP has not done any research on that, but that's an excellent topic for research. So maybe throw that one into BC CAT's research committee, and perhaps they'd like to do that one.
That does sound like a research project we would do. You mentioned a little bit earlier in your presentation that data on the impact of the pandemic is only starting to emerge. Do you have a sense of when we will have a full sense of some of the impact of the pandemic on the student mobility data?
Well, we do the student mobility studies every 2 years. So I would expect for sure in the next 2 years, so 2 years into the future, we will have something, unless there's some sense of urgency. Maybe we'll do something next year.
All right. Shauna Rossloot from Saskatchewan actually has an interesting question. How is this student data mobility used? So what type of decision making does this influence? Do you want to maybe reflect a little bit upon that?
Well, I don't make the decisions, I just produce the data, but I suspect that institutions could be using this data to help them plan in terms of capacity. They can look at the, the supply of students in certain programs in certain feeder institutions and help that. They could use that data to help them predict how many students will be coming from those programs at other institutions into their own institution, just as an example. But I'm sure there's lots of other examples, and maybe some of our audience can share with us how they use this mobility data.
I mean, the wealth of information is actually really quite incredible, and it goes back over a decade now. And so you can really draw some real inferences from the mobility patterns that have been gathered over the years. If people want to gain access to that information, what's the best way that they can do that?
Well, on the STP website, there's a number of different reports on student mobility, including the new one that should soon be released. There's also a number of different graphics, such as that student mobility diagram showing mobility between regions and institution types. And we also have what we call student pathways diagrams, where we can show students flowing into an institution and flowing out. So lots of resources on the STP website.
Yeah, so if you do a Google for Student Transitions Project in BC, you'll be able to get access to that website, where you can find quite a few of the reports that are available to the sector. I have another question from the audience from Wilma Gust from North Island College. How does the mobility of Aboriginal students affect their completion rates?
How does the mobility of Aboriginal students affect their completion rates? I would expect that the mobility of any student would affect their completion rate differently, depending on how efficiently they are accumulating credits towards their final degree program or their final credential goal. So I don't think it's necessarily any different for Aboriginal students than it is for other students, but that's certainly a topic for further research if there's more interest in such a topic as that.
All right, and then we're basically at the top of the hour. I thought I might just ask one perhaps a speculative question on your part. What are some of the research questions that are emerging as a result of the pandemic? Has that had any impact on the type of trends that you guys are analyzing as part of this project?
I never get the questions directly to me, but I suspect some of the questions might be such things like, how has student mobility been affected? You know, are students more mobile or less mobile because of the pandemic? Were students more likely to enroll in multiple institutions at the same time because they could, because they're working, you know, as a student from home? I'm sure there's a lot of different questions that we could be investigating, you know, including, you know, just basic enrollment trends and whatnot, but those aren't specific to mobility.
All right, and we do have one final question just submitted. It's from Lisa Pender from the University of Victoria. She asks, is the finding that international students are less mobile than domestic students, is that based on undergraduate programs, or is it based on all programs, which includes vocational and graduate programs as well?
That includes all students enrolled in academic credits. So that would include both undergraduate and graduate students. And as to why the international students are about half as mobile as the domestic students, I suspect it has something to do with just the way they planned their post-secondary education. Maybe they're not as willing to move around between institutions. Maybe they've just got a lockstep plan to stay at one institution. But I haven't done any research on that, but that's a good topic for a survey.
All right. Well, we are at 3 o'clock, so I am going to draw this session to a close. I just want to thank you, Joanne, for once again giving us an excellent presentation and overview of student mobility research. And like I said to everyone at the top, this session will be made available later tonight once we upload it to the website, and we'll also make the presentation available as well. So thank you for attending. And we are now going to roll right into the wrap up. So thank you, Joanne.
Thank you.
All right. And so that brings us to a close of day one. It is now in the books. I really appreciate all the interaction and engagement over the course of the day. The chat has been extremely active. The questions have been on point. And I do appreciate everyone that has been asking or submitting photos, as well as just participating in general. Tomorrow, we will be kicking off a little bit later than we did this morning. So we will be starting at 9:30 a.m. And you will want to be there at 9:30 a.m. because this is when we will be presenting this year's BC CAT Transfer Award. We put together a special presentation for that session. Tomorrow's sessions will also feature a panel on the pandemic 1 year later, as well as an overview of reverse transfer and approaches in micro-credentials. Just a reminder that the photo contest, please keep submitting your entries. The deadline is 1 p.m. tomorrow. And please make sure you also take a look at other people's pictures and vote on them. I've had a good time going through them. I think that the creativity is wonderful, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys come up with tomorrow. So that is a wrap on day one. I will see you tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Thank you.